I'm so excited to chat with Nina Simons today. Nina Simons is the co founder and chief relationship strategist at Bioneers and leads its Every Women's Leadership program. Bioneers is a nonprofit that uses media, convening, and connecting to lift up visionary and practical solutions for many of our most pressing social and ecological challenges using a whole system approach. Nina is a social entrepreneur who's passionate about reinventing leadership, restoring the feminine, and co creating a healthy, peaceful, and equitable world for all. She speaks and teaches internationally at schools, conferences, and festivals, co facilitates transformative workshops and retreats for women that share practices for regenerative leadership through relational mindfulness. And she's also the author of Nature, Culture, and the Sacred. And I know she has so much love and wisdom to share with us today. She's joining me from Santa Fe, New Mexico, in the USA. Welcome to the show, Nina.
Thank you so much, Kaki. I'm so happy to be here with you.
Oh, I am so excited for this conversation. You don't understand how excited I am. I've been waiting for you to be on my podcast. Um, but Nina, before we dive into our conversation, I always love to ask my guests this question, and that is, what is your definition of an awakened feminine?
Mm, well, I believe that we are all products of cultures that have um, elevated some of our human qualities and devalued many, many others. And as it happens, those human qualities tend to sort out by gender. And so, in the aftermath of hundreds or perhaps thousands of years of patriarchal culture, we have devalued our relational intelligence. We've devalued our empathy. We've devalued our intuition. We've devalued our willingness to not know and to listen more than we talk and to collaborate. And we have consciously or unconsciously bought into systems of domination and of hierarchy and of winner take all. And so really what I advocate for and watch for cultivating in myself, Kaki, is how do I cultivate myself to be a full spectrum leader? Because we all have masculine and feminine within us. And I believe the root cause of most of the pain and suffering and degradation and loss we're seeing in the world today is due to that imbalance, not only in each of us individually, but in our systems and societies and governance and institutions. So that's a long way of answering. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, that definitely answered my question. And I'm like getting the full body tingles here. So thank you. I love that definition. It's yeah, so deep and so true. So just, it's truth. That is what's happened over the many, many years, especially in the last few years. Nina, I want to ask you, okay, I know you've got a lot to share. So, and this question is very broad, but I would love for you to share with us, a bit more about who you are and why you do what you do. I know we were just talking before, and 𝐍𝐢𝐧𝐚 said, "I haven't read your book yet," and but I know in your book you do share your story of that, awakening to everything that you do. So, if you would like to give us a little summary of you, that'll be amazing.
I would love to, Kaki. Thank you for asking. Well, I am a woman of many, many interests. And in the course of growing myself into who I believe my soul called me here to be, I started out the daughter of artists in a big city in New York City. And so I assumed my path would be in the arts. And later I did a bunch of work with a mystical school called Eureka that really gave me a toolkit about how to relate to myself, to others, and to the world by integrating a lot of the best practices from many of the world's most ancient mystical traditions. Then I moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico. And let's see, when I met my husband, soon to be husband, I had called him in, and and I was about in my late 20s at the time, and he was a filmmaker. And I went with him to a biodiversity garden that was extraordinary. And because I had grown up in a city, I really didn't know anything about gardening or farming. But as we walked through this garden, being given a tour by the master gardener who was cultivating it, he introduced us to each plant, telling us the Latin name and the common name. And then he explained how it was related to all the plants around it. And there were hundreds and hundreds of varieties of food and herb and grain plants all around us. And it was just the most gorgeous array of colors and shapes and smells. And then he invited us to taste as we walked through the garden. And so I was tasting these tomatoes of every color and size and shape. This was in the late 1980s. And I was tasting herbs like lemon licorice mint and chocolate basil. And I realized my senses were just ecstatic. They were dancing. And I fell in love in that garden. And then the master gardener named 𝐍𝐢𝐬𝐧𝐚 started explaining to us that the reason he was growing this garden was to save all of the seeds of these beautiful plants, because the biodiversity of the food supply was under serious and accelerating threat because of the concentration of how major multinational corporations were buying up all the mom and pop seed shops that had been cultivating and saving and preserving these seeds, often for hundreds of years. And also, many of the seeds that he was cultivating were traditional varieties, so they had been cultivated by indigenous peoples really for millennia. And by the time I walked out of that garden, I had these two energies within me. One was the ecstasy of the magnificence. I thought, this is what the Garden of Eden must have been like. And the other was the threat to the world's food supply. And I walked out of that garden, and it felt like the spirit of the natural world tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You're working for me now." And I was totally shocked. I immediately said, "Oh no, I don't know anything about this stuff. I don't know how to do this." And very soon after, my then boyfriend, Kenny, and that master gardener started a seed company called Seeds of Change. And I quit my job in the arts and I went to work for Seeds of Change. And I embarked on the steepest learning curve of my life. And eventually the board asked me to become president of that company. We were growing it hand over fist. I was learning how to write business plans and raise money and all the things and negotiate with seed growers, and all the things I had to do. And then Kenny was researching about people who had really creative, innovative solutions for many of our most challenging problems, both social and ecological. And he was finding amazing people. And one day he was in a hot tub with a friend, and he was telling him about all these people he was discovering. And he said, the world needs to know about these people. They're extraordinary. And the mainstream media isn't carrying the good news of the innovations that are coming up, only the bad news of the damage. And, so in order to really ignite people's inspiration and sense of possibility, they need to know. And the friend said, "Why don't you have a conference?" And Kenny said, "Well, that sounds boring. Why would I do that? I've never been to a conference." And the friend said, "Here's a grant, go have a conference." And Kenny came to me because I had a background in theater and knew how to produce events, and said, "Will you help me make a conference?" So that was the very beginning of Bioneers. And it was partly in response to James Hansen first beginning to sound the alarm about climate change. And I remember sitting there at the first conference with my mouth hanging open, just saying, oh my gosh, these are the people whose leadership I want to serve. And many of the people we were featuring were Native peoples. And so I got turned on very early to the particular qualities of wisdom and knowledge base that many Native peoples carry in this time. And it was years after that that I really discovered how gender affected my leadership. I was acknowledged in a magazine for my leadership, and I didn't like it at all, Kaki. I thought, I'm not sure I've earned this, and I don't really like the visual picture that it conjures for me. And it feels a little like it paints a target on my back. And I don't know that I want to be called a leader. But I had learned from Bioneers that what the earth calls for all of us to grow into at this time is our own individual forms of leadership. So I thought, what's wrong with this picture if I don't like being called a leader, but that's what's most needed? So I began investigating that. And at around that time, I saw a film which everyone can see online that's called The Burning Times. And when I saw The Burning Times, it's a film that was made in the early 90s by a Canadian filmmaker, and it tells the story of the 300 to 500 year period that had different versions all over the earth, where somewhere between 50,000 and several million women were systematically persecuted and tortured and burned for the supposed crime of being witches. And I was shocked when I saw this film. And I thought, this can't be true. Why didn't I learn it in school? But for the first time, it made sense to me, because for the first time I understood why I had such a fear of speaking my truth in public. And for the first time, I really got it that if 7 generations of children saw all the women around them, their mothers and aunties and grandmothers and sisters, systematically tortured and burned, wow, that leaves an impression. And of course, science has now proven that there is such a thing as intergenerational trauma, and that it passes on through our DNA, actually. So I began to understand that imbalance in the world was what was causing all the problems I was learning about through Bioneers. And I began to really investigate my own internalized oppression as a woman. And I started convening very diverse women who were diverse not only ethnically or racially, but by age and by discipline and by sexual orientation. And I began with colleagues convening women for a deep dive into cultivating women's leadership. And ultimately, and then that morphed into more and more of a focus in my life on racial equity and on understanding the intersection between gender and racial equity. And so when I had the opportunity to release this book for the second time in June of this year, it just thrilled me, because I was able to weave into it much of the tools and experiences and exercises that I had used and learned from 20 years of convening women to help cultivate leadership. So that's kind of a short bio.
An amazing bio. And I know that there's so much more to your bio than, what you've just told us. So I'm just listening to go, oh my goodness, this is so amazing. Just what you've done in your life is so needed, and just wow. I want to talk to you. So I ask questions just by what pops up in my head. So when you received the tap on the shoulder, when you came out of the garden, and you're like, what? Were you someone that was spiritual before, or was that what just happened? Like, like how did you come to terms with that? And did things just kind of like it sounded like things just you were just naturally pushed that way, but was there some resistance?
Oh, of course there was. There was deep questioning and resistance. I had done some spiritual training before then, but truth be told, Kaki, I mean, what I've noticed in my life is that, for one thing, I am in a continual practice of learning how to listen with more than my ears, right? Because sometimes I just get a flash in a dream, or, you know, my intuition or my body just, you know, lets me know something. What I've learned to do, I mean, I think probably each of our instruments are slightly different. So everyone has to learn for themselves how they get that information. But what I've found is that when ideas come to me and they won't let me go, that's when I have to pay attention. You know, I once had a wonderful teacher tell me when I was really impatient to find my path, she said, you have to pay exquisite attention to notice inwardly when your flame grows brighter. And you have to pay exquisite attention because sometimes it's really quick and it's just a little, you know, and if you're not paying attention, you could miss it. So that was a great clue along the way. But that was one of those times when what I sensed and what I heard in my inner ears was so clear that I couldn't deny it. And even though I didn't, you know, the curious thing to me, Kaki, is that in my experience, most women who do amazing leadership things step into them without knowing how they're going to do them. They only know that their heart is pulling them there. And that's how I felt. You know, it was an act of devotion that I showed up for Seeds of Change. And it was very helpful for me because I learned very quickly that I had to be able to say, I don't know the answer to this, or I don't know what's next, and not have it diminish my stature or my belief in myself, but really be open to the wisdom of those around me.
Thank you. I think that like what you just said was needed. Like the people that are going to be listening to this episode just needed to hear that sometimes we not sometimes, we don't need to know how. We just need to follow the pull.
Yes. And you know, a friend of mine says it this way, Caroline Casey, who's a wonderful astrologer. She says, you know, the gods and goddesses don't need us to know the how. They just need us to identify the what. And they'll take care of the how. Once we make a decision and a commitment, the path often opens before our feet.
It does. I've had a very confirming experience recently where when I decided and just fully said yes, and without the resistance, like the kicking and screaming, things just happen. Like it's like they're like, yes, you finally said yes. We're just going to give you all the pieces without that, and it just flows. And so, I love that. Thank you for sharing that. Two things have popped up that I want to ask you. So, do you mind sharing a bit more about what Bioneers does? Because I know there's, you know, the innovation around, you know, the earth and how we can, you know, create sustainability and how we can protect our land, but also there's the leadership component, and I know there's quite a few other things. So just maybe share a little bit about what you do, like what Bioneers does.
Sure. Well, the name Bioneers comes from biological pioneers, because many of the people we feature are people who have learned from nature how to heal with nature. And really part of what I love most about Bioneers is that as human beings, I think we've made one basic systems error. which is to imagine that the human world and the natural world are separate. And what Bioneers says is, no, we're all part of the same living system. And so what Bioneers does is we do kind of an ecological and social star search. And we actually find people, some of whom you may have heard of and some of whom you may not have heard of yet, who have tackled some challenging issue, and it's in people from all walks of life. So we speak to, how do we reinvent education so it's meaningful and it works, right? What do we need to do about the food system and our nutrition and how we treat our health and planetary health at the same time? What are we going to do about how unfettered capitalism is wrecking the planet? And how do we at the same time cultivate ourselves inwardly to really show up for this lifetime that we probably all chose to be here for, and that I believe we're the right people to be here for. And even though it's hard and it's kind of a marathon that we're in, I do believe that every one of us has gifts to offer the world. And so, and they're very specific to each of us. And so it becomes super important that we peel away some of the layers of conditioning that may have those self-limiting voices that say, oh, I'm not this enough, or I'm not that enough, because actually we all are already enough. And so Bioneers is this co-creative celebration festival. One of my favorite metaphors is that in nature, the places of greatest creativity and innovation are the places where two or more ecosystems meet. So where the river meets the ocean meets the forest, that's where new species evolve and cross-pollinate. And Bioneers is like that because it's a beautiful pluralistic space that has indigenous peoples and indigenous worldview at its heart, and also a rebalanced masculine and feminine at its heart. And at the same time is also looking at very practical, tangible, real solutions, because together they illustrate the future that's possible for us if only we can muster the political will to get there. It's far more possible than most people know.
Yeah.
And so it's a fountain of solutions, and it's both an annual conference, it's a ton of media online, it's a fantastic every 2 weeks newsletter, and it's podcasts, and all of them together really surface this incredible vision of hope.
What a beautiful vision and a beautiful, beautiful service that it's providing. So I just wanted you to talk about it so people know. And I know you're a not-for-profit, so for anyone that's listening or watching this right now that feel a call to save the earth and just and feel that what Nina has just spoken about really pulls at your heart, then please have a look up Bioneers and and get involved. The other couple of questions I want to ask you. The first one being storytelling. You were talking, I know in your book you have stories, other women as well telling their stories in your book as well. I want to ask you why you believe storytelling is so important for helping us raise our collective consciousness.
Yeah, well, for many reasons. For one thing, I think 30 years of Bioneers has convinced me, because I have seen, hundreds and thousands of extraordinary leaders tell stories that really open people's hearts and minds. And there's a fellow named George Lakoff. What he does is he's a cognitive linguist. So he studies stories. And what he says is that once our hearts have wrapped around a story, no amount of facts to the contrary will get us to release that story. The only thing that will get us to release it and move on is a better story. And, I am lucky enough to know 𝐸𝐬𝐧𝐚 𝐒𝐢𝐬𝐧𝐬, now known as V, who wrote the Vagina Monologues. And that's an example, I write about her in the book, of storytelling that has shifted global mass consciousness in an extraordinary way. And so, I believe that the task ahead involves not only practical and visionary solutions and self-cultivation, but that actually we're all co-creating a new culture. And that the culture we are co-creating is not just new, some of it is traditional and very ancient. And so we are marrying ancient with modern or postmodern. And I think storytelling is how we transform culture. It's how traditional cultures have always done it. And I think that, as women, because we are often gifted with a quality of relational intelligence and empathy, we can be especially good at storytelling, each in our own ways. And whether it's with children or adults, whether it's through arts or parenting, there are so many ways, as Rumi says, to kneel and kiss the ground, Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of what we're all here for right now.
Yeah. As you're talking, I was just seeing like a bunch of people around a fire, just listening to storytelling. And that was, like you say, it was what used to happen. We just sit and listen to stories, and that's how we learn, and that's how we share the wisdom, which really brings me to, and then when you were talking about bringing that, traditional wisdom in with the modern, I think that is just so needed. It's, I feel like sometimes not sometimes, but a lot of times with the Western, with our, current technological society, we forget the ancient wisdom, the traditional wisdom, because it's, this is all new. This is all the, this is the new bread and butter. This is the new thing. And then we forget all the wisdom that, there must be some, some truth or some, something with traditional wisdom, because it's been passed on for thousands of years. You won't pass it on if it's, if there's nothing to it. So I think it's, really important. Which really brings me to the next question, and it's talking about the indigenous wisdom, the guardians of the earth. I know you are now really interested in this part of your, this is kind of like the new part of your journey, like the latest part of your journey, I would say, to like really develop that relationship with indigenous leaders, and to bring their knowledge into this new world as well. So can you talk a bit more about, I guess, when you discovered that indigenous wisdom is so important, and what you've seen, how it can really help us to change the landscape that we are currently living in?
Yes, thank you for that. That's a great question. I have been so fortunate, 𝐍𝐢𝐧𝐚, to be mentored by a great number of indigenous elders, and I've learned so much from them. And, some of what I've learned has to do with the value of humility. And in one way, I titled my book Nature, Culture, and the Sacred, because for me, that's where indigenous wisdom lives, in the confluence of those three places. And, science is increasingly proving that nature is amazingly intelligent, and that there's a marvelous little short YouTube video that listeners can find called "The Mycelium is Listening." And it's got Paul Stamets's voice, who's sort of the godfather of the mycelium, talking about how science has now proven that the mycelium, which is sort of the under the ground part of mushrooms, right, that actually connects whole forests and whole landscapes. And the mycelium actually respond to sound. And the sound that they respond to the most is low frequency sound, like the sound that traditional peoples have made for millennia in seasonal ceremonies with their drums. So, this is not just some airy-fairy idea, right? This is humanity in a dialogue with the mycelium, with the earth, to call and ask for rain, to offer gratitude, to treat it with the respect that it deserves as another sentient being. They've also discovered that plants can see color. There are all these discoveries now. And indigenous peoples, not only for me, carry the wisdom of some core instructions about how to be a human being, but also about how to live in right relationship with the natural world. Traditional ecological knowledge carries wisdom about how to relate to fire in a way that actually regenerates forests instead of being in danger of wildfires destroying massive tracts of land, and how to relate to the living world as if with reverence and as if it's alive and a relation. And then the third thing is, it all comes together in terms of the extractive industries which are destroying the planet and still drilling for oil and gas and coal and minerals. And most of the land that they are targeting for drilling is guarded by indigenous peoples. And there is a pandemic around the world that is rarely spoken of. But when those corporations target a particular area, they target the women first. They move in man camps. And the man camps start, stealing the women and raping the women and trafficking the women. And that destroys the men in turn, because the men feel helpless to defend them, and so the women are being used as a weapon of war in the war against Mother Earth. And so for me, and there's also one more thing that I would say about this, which is that the more that I have learned about the history of indigenous peoples on this earth and the ways that they have been treated over the last 500 to thousands of years, the more I recognize that indigenous peoples have suffered perhaps more than almost any other single group of peoples on this planet. And in fact, we're all indigenous to Mother Earth, right? So, and there are many indigenous prophecies and rituals that speak to now is the time to stop being divided by color or nation or anything else. We need to be one species. We need to gather the great minds in unity. And so in writing a blurb for my book, the great Buddhist teacher, Joanna Macy, said something that I've only really recently realized how important it is. She said that the book not only recognizes the unique contributions that women bring to leadership, and women and the feminine, I would say, but also how adversity and challenge refines them and strengthens us. And so I think that's an important thing to bear in mind as we're all facing all kinds of adversity and challenges, and our ancestors have too. Yeah.
Thank you.
But it's made us stronger for now.
Yes. Oh gosh, when you were talking about being in unity, regardless of, race, color, everything, religion, whatever else that we divide ourselves, the tears just started coming. I'm like, okay.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Sorry, I just need to, because I really feel that in my heart.
Yes.
I don't cry a lot on my podcast, and I think there's probably only like 3 podcasts where I'm like, That
I'm
really
really
just
honored,
touched.
Kaki, and you
Yeah.
don't need to apologize. I think our emotions are one of nature's ways of speaking through us. And so I'm really honored that I moved you to tears. Thank you. It's my fondest wish too, you
Yeah.
know? It's
Thank
so
you.
needed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like, because that is also like one of my greatest wishes to see unity,
Yeah.
especially in the last few years where it's just been like everyone's just tearing each other apart and it hurts because
Yes.
I'm sure you are as well, just very sensitive
Yes.
to all of it.
Yes, and there are some very destructive forces using divide and conquer strategies in very scary ways, particularly on social media,
Yeah.
to get people polarized. And honestly, I think it's a time where we have to move beyond binaries. We have to move beyond them in male female. We have to move beyond them in every other way that we tend to polarize.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. And yeah, I think
Mm.
sometimes the scary thing is people don't see it.
Yeah.
So it's yeah. Okay. I'm okay now. Sorry.
You've
Thank
been
you.
okay all
Thank
along.
you for touching my
Mm,
heart and my soul. So
mm,
yeah.
mm.
Yeah, but just beautiful wisdom that you shared with us about Indigenous people, because, just also like, living in Australia, knowing the history of our Indigenous people
Yeah,
as well. It's,
yeah,
yeah, it's actually quite interesting because probably prior to me doing all this work, I was never really interested in
mm,
the indigenous population. Not like as yeah, like never been really like fascinated. It is that fascination. Now it's like, oh, like all the wisdom that they have, it really fascinates me. So yeah, it's time. It is time, like
yes.
you say.
Well, and especially when we realize how hard won it has been for them to retain all that wisdom,
Yeah.
to teach their languages, to hold on to traditions when so many of our cultures have sought to break them and,
Yes.
and make them and erase them and make them forget.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially can see here because of of all the things we brought over. Well,
Mm,
not probably not my culture, but like when they were taken over by Western society, like the
yes.
alcohol, all the things that are
Yeah.
toxic to their
Yeah.
nature is taught to them so that they can't grow, they can't evolve
Yes.
as a population. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, whew, okay. I want to talk about female leadership because you mentioned quite a few times now how, you know, how when we raise up women, everyone else wins.
Yes.
Can you share a bit about your experience with that and, why you truly believe that is the way to
Mm.
really help us evolve and, and win?
Well, I think first of all, Kaki, I want to say that I don't think we have to save the earth. I think the earth will survive no matter what. I think we are actually need to save our own species at this point. And I think that the threats posed by the climate crisis are far more serious and imminent than most people understand yet. And so that's a really important thing. Um, well, you don't have to take it from me. There's amazing evidence, actually. I have believed this for a long time, but um, there are scholars who have done a lot of research and say that gender bias is the deepest bias in the human psyche around the world. And when I first heard that, I really wondered if that was true. I mean, deeper than faith or religion or race or any other class. But in fact, I have come to believe that it's true. and that it's been reinforced over and over through generations. And that means that it's in women as much as it is in men, right? It's in all of us. And so what the UN and various other great researchers have proven is that the more you increase women's leadership and women's education and women's rights, especially reproductive rights, it's one of the greatest responses to climate change that we can do as a global community. So Paul Hawken did something called Drawdown, where teams of researchers researched the very best solutions. And when you put together women's rights, reproductive rights, women's education, and women's leadership, together they are among the top 3 solutions to regenerating our healthy climate. And then when you study, the countries where women have been in leadership, you see how, by and large, they responded to the COVID pandemic far better than anybody else. And there's a marvelous book that I would recommend to your listeners too, and a website called The Athena Doctrine. And it's by 2 male researchers who did this extensive meta-research project. And they surveyed people from thousands and thousands of people from 13 nations. And 66% of them agreed that the world would be a healthier and better place if more people led like women. Mm-hmm. So I think, it's not only women's leadership that we need to lift up, it's how are we redefining leadership. And my first book was called Moonrise, The Power of Women Leading from the Heart. And it's a very beautiful collection of essays by a number of leaders, 2 of whom are men, who are modeling the new leadership that I think we're all co-creating and co-evolving. And it's a leadership that comes from the heart rather than the head. It exemplifies that thing I was talking about earlier about not knowing the how, only having to know the what, mm-hmm. And it's collaborative leadership. It's sharing power and authority and exercising relational intelligence so that, you are designing your strategy for the community and the space that you're doing work in and that you want to help transform. And so, I think that we're all in a massive reinvention of leadership and of identity and of human civilization, frankly, which means that there are a gazillion opportunities for everyone's creativity. And boy, is it needed. And really the biggest key is believing in your vision and not letting go and trusting and praying, when I first became a fundraiser, because leading a nonprofit in the US, you have to fundraise. And I really didn't understand the power of prayer. And this is something that indigenous cultures often teach us too, is like, one of my wonderful teachers is a man named Oren Lyons, and he's the faith keeper for the Iroquois 6 Nations. And he's an elder, and he said, we have something on our side that Monsanto can't touch, and that's the power of prayer. And it's our superpower. And, when I began to learn how to fundraise, I thought, really, I should pray? Well, yes, actually. It's sort of proven over and over, right? Praying and calling in what you really want to see happen has tremendous capacity. And another thing that I've learned from Native peoples that's been an amazing tool for me, and I talk about it a lot in my book, is the power of ritual to cultivate ourselves, and that we all have the capacity to kind of make up rituals that will change our inner frameworks and even our neurology over time. And that practicing a ritual and holding ourselves accountable to it is a tremendous tool for our toolkit.
Yeah, definitely resonate and agree with everything that you said. It's Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And just as you were talking, and I was thinking, this is a great time to ask you this question. Um, when you mentioned before that when you were first written up as a leader, you didn't like it, and you were like, I don't want that target on me. How then did you accept that you are a leader?
Mm. Well, uh, it took a lot of work. Honestly, I mean, in many ways, Kaki, I think one of the things that I found was that I not only had to stop the habit of self criticizing and self judging and self limiting beliefs that I was perpetuating to keep myself small. But at the same time, I had to learn and practice how to appreciate and actually learn to love myself, not in a hallmark way, but in a way that, but in a way that is both humble and dignified, and that balances those two, and that recognizes that, I seem to be an instrument, like I believe each of us are, with very particular gifts to bring to the world at this time. And I had to learn to value those gifts. And it required practice, it required sisterhood, it required perseverance and holding myself accountable. And over time, it's really what was the motivation behind this book was, wow, I learned over 20 years how to become who I felt I was born to be. And I want that for everyone. And I especially want it for every woman and every girl and, and every man. And one of my favorite reviews on Amazon came from a father who said, "This book helps me understand the women in my life better, my wife, my daughters, my sister, but it also helps me understand the feminine in me better." Mm-hmm. And I was like, wow, yay.
Tears are
That's
coming.
Wonderful.
Oh.
Well, how can we put it in the water, right? And dose the whole world. Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I mean,
yeah.
What a gift. And
yeah,
I'm just so grateful to have been able to just speak to you and just pull out bits of wisdom. And I know there's so much more in there that I love to bring out as well. Hopefully you would like to come back on at another time just so we can talk more. But I'm just looking at the time like we have to wrap up. But what a beautiful beautiful way to end the podcast with you talking about how you accepted your leadership and how important it is to understand women, for the feminine, not just for women, but also for men. So thank you. Really touched me.
Thank you for making this beautiful podcast possible and for the gift that you are to the world and for your strong and open heart. I really, really thank you for it because you model what we all need to be. And that's beautiful. And it's really a gift. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you so much. Thank you for spending time with me today and sharing your love and wisdom. And if people want to find out more about you or where they can find you, and more about Bioneers, what's the best place to go?
Online, go visit bioneers.org/NCS book, which is Nature, Culture, and the Sacred Book, or just visit bioneers.org and sign up for the newsletter. If you want to know more about me in particular, I have a website that's ninasimons.com, and I'm also on LinkedIn, and hope I get to see you again, Keki. It's really been a joy and an honor.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nina. I'll have all your details in the show notes so people can find you and the Bioneers. And thank you once again for sharing this time with me.
My joy.